have a look at a wonderful model that's really useful for understanding and remembering parts of the brain and their activities yourself, and also for sharing with people that you're working with. Sometimes when we start to talk about the brain, people can think, whoa, there's a lot of new terms, that's a really big area. But when you actually break it down and look at the individual chunks, it can become really accessible. So this model is not something that you've got to lug around in your bag extra that's going to take up a lot of space or that you're going to be worried about forgetting. It's your hand. Now, we have to give amazing credit to Daniel Siegel for coming up with this idea and for sharing it readily in multiple different places. He tends to utilize this when working with parents in his work and explaining to parents how the different areas of the brain work in adults and in children, and what they can do to help regulate emotions more easily. Today we're going to look at it with a special angle on how coaches can use it in their work. So this is the model. It ends up looking like this. So this is how the brain would be in my skull here looking out. But going back to basics, we've got here the spinal column and the brain stem. So the spinal cord that travels down the wrist and then the brain stem that sits in the palm of the hand are really involved in our basic survival. So our fight or flight response, those autonomic functions that involve the beating of our heart and our lungs expanding and contracting. So really foundational responsibilities that these parts of the brain have. Then in the middle of our brain, in the real depths, the center of our brain, we've got the limbic regions, so multiple different areas of the brain that are considered to be responsible primarily for emotional regulation, emotional functions. So if we were suddenly feeling very nervous or very excited, then we would expect activity in this region of the brain. Then folded over the top, and we can think of it, Siegel talks about it as the highest part of the brain, the highest both geographically and in terms of its functionality. It's the part of the brain that evolves last as we grow up in children, and that is really well developed in humans. So right down, so it's called the cortex, and it's responsible for our thinking, our processing, our evaluation, and for regulating other parts of the brain. So for making sense of signals and feelings, and heavily involved in this regulation process. It's also around here on our fingertips. This is the prefrontal cortex, we think of it as, and the prefrontal cortex, you might remember, we can think of as the brain's CEO or the conductor of the brain. And typically when we think about the brain in our clients doing thinking work or processing work, we'll be thinking about this type of the brain. It's really important to think of the brain as a whole, but most people tend to gravitate towards thinking about the prefrontal cortex initially. So that's the basic structure of this model and of the brain. What gets really exciting is when we start thinking about the interaction and the integration between the different elements within the brain, the different areas, the different networks, and how we can strengthen those networks. And they're the things that, as coaches, we've got a real opportunity to dive into and help our clients understand more about how this brain works and how we can shape it to work best for each of us as individuals.